medals, medal education that it then reflects on American medalists and how many actually trained in France because of for a variety of reasons that we'll be discussing. Let me just see. Whoops. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. All right. And we'll be talking specifically during the period of what is known as Art Nouveau. And as I said, my talk will actually be the first part, just so you know, you don't get scared because we will be talking about American engravers, but the first part focuses really on France because to understand why Americans went to France in the first place, you have to understand the French system for training sculptor engravers and also a little bit of background about the whole Art Nouveau movement. So we're going to be discussing that a bit. So first of all, let me just go ahead here. There. Okay. So to understand, we go back a few years, as Michael knows, but he took the course. So we're going to start back with the reign of Louis XIV. So this is the origin of the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts. And in going back to 1648, Cardinal Mazarin, under Louis XIV, established the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris. And the purpose was to take the most talented French students, potential artists, painters, sculptors, engravers, and to give them a comprehensive education in art. So they established this academy, and there were actually several schools, the most prestigious being then the first was the École Nationale Supérieure de Beaux-Arts in Paris. And then over years, there actually were regional branches established for students in other parts of the country to take and study. Very often, though, they would then get filtered into the main school in Paris. And you see, there were schools in Lyon, in Nancy, Bordeaux, and such. The academy also established, which is very important, the Prix de Rome, which was a scholarship which was paid for by the state, which allowed the best students to take and study in what was then considered the Mecca for fine art, which was Italy, Rome. And it was subsidized, so they could go there for a period of 3 to 5 years and study Italian art and the Roman art, in Rome, architecture and paintings and sculpture. And originally they would establish the academy at the Palazzo Mancini, which you see was established fairly early, 1666. And during the reign of Napoleon, it was moved to the Villa Medici in 1803. And it was considered part under the aegis of royalty, under the whoever was the king or what have you, up until the reign of Louis Napoleon, and then the school became independent of the government, the royalty, in 1863. So we'll talk a little bit about the École des Beaux-Arts. The curriculum was actually divided into two schools. There was one dealing with fine art, which was considered painting and sculpture, another one devoted to architecture. The programs were fashioned around teaching about, again, it was the Renaissance period, so it was a revival of interest and knowledge in ancient Greek and Roman culture and art. So this would be, again, ancient Greek and Roman sculpture and architecture. And the students had to demonstrate proficiency in various drawing skills, and they would advance to more advanced teaching in terms of figure drawing, painting, sculpture, and such. And the ultimate prize was the Grand Prix de Rome, trying to get the scholarship to spend several years in Rome. And the list of, it's basically a who's who of French art, the people who actually took and were trained at the École and then went on to get the Prix de Rome, as you see, names like Degas, Delacroix, Renoir, Seurat, but not everybody. I mean, there were some glaring instances of I guess, kind of the people who were not admitted to the school, who then obviously went on and were very successful artists. And just to name a few, it's Manet, Rodin, and Cezanne. So the fact that you didn't get into the École des Beaux-Arts didn't necessarily mean that you weren't a good artist or that you couldn't subsequently have a career in art, but it certainly helped. And the award originally were for painters and sculptures, but then it was expanded over the years. So the award then included architecture in 1720, music, engraving, and for our purpose, there was a separate award for metal engraving, which was established in 1803. So now we'll talk just a bit about the Prix de Rome. So as I said, it was located at the Palazzo Mancini, and that's a depiction of it on the upper right. And then it was relocated to the Villa Medici, and that's actually a contemporary photo of the Villa Medici. And the first awardee was the French medalist Nicolas Pierre Thiollier in 1805. And it was awarded every 4 years, starting in 1831, every 3 years in 1863. One thing about the École and about the award, which was apparent, glaringly apparent, was that women were not admitted. They were only permitted later on in the late 19th century and were allowed to compete for the Prix de Rome after 1903. So it took some time. It's just a list of some of the notable winners of the Prix de Rome. The medalist Eugene André Audenet in 1831. And then you'll recognize, if you're familiar with the Beaux-Arts period, this is a who's who of famous sculptor engravers in that period. So Daniel Dupuy won in 1872. They also awarded second and third prizes. Didn't get to go to Rome, but it was still something of a feather in your cap just to get even a second or third prize. But Oscar Rodi, very important figure, got the second prize in 1872, competed again in 1875, and then he won the Grand Prix de Rome in 1875. It was followed by Louis Alexandre Botte in 78. Pate won in 81. Frederick Vernon got the second prize. Vernon then won first prize in 1887, so on. Charles Pillet, George Dupré. The award continued until 1968 when it was abolished. But again, this is like a who's who of famous French medalists. There was also the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs, and sometimes you see people who would get into this school who then would move on to the École des Beaux-Arts. The Art Decorative School was established in 1766 as the École Royale Gratuite de Dessin, which is the free school of design by Jean-Jacques Bachelier, who was a painter. He directed the porcelain factory at Sèvres. So, and this had more to do with kind of arts and crafts as opposed to the quote fine arts. And this was to improve the quality of manufactured goods, which would include things like china, porcelain, furniture, and other items. So in 1877, this actually then became the National School of Decorative Arts, the École Nationale des Arts Décoratifs, and now it's the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs since 1927. And it's known, for example, the Art Deco movement was based to a large extent by what was going on at this school, the famous exposition in 1925. And over the years, it's expanded to include other things that I guess were somewhat independent of the fine arts, but they were linked to fine arts, which include things like photography, animation, industrial design, video, interior design, fashion, textiles, engraving, a whole variety of different skills. In addition to the official academies, the official écoles, there were also private academies. This was important during the late 19th century. And very often students would take and study at the private academies, and they had some really superb professors, some of whom also taught at the official écoles. And they would train so that this way they could then move on to the École des Beaux-Arts. They usually were not very stringent entry requirements. So very often you would start at a private academy. To go to the École des Beaux-Arts, you had to pass a series of exams in order to qualify. So very often you would start here to be able to prepare for entry into the École des Beaux-Arts. And another important point is that these academies allowed women. So if you're a woman artist, sculptor, engraver, you could take and to study at these academies and gain proficiency in various fields. There were several well-known ones. There was the Academy Colarossi, which existed from 1870 to 1930, and it was founded by an Italian model and sculptor, Filippo Colarossi. There was actually very important, the Academy Julian, which was established by Rudolph Julian in 1867 and continued until 1968. And it had several important structures. Probably the most important one was Henri Chaput, who's an important sculptor engraver. And there was the Academy Vidi, which existed for a short period of time from 1889 till up to World War I, 1914, which was established by Cesare Viti and his wife Maria and her sisters. And this academy also had some prominent instructors, including Paul Gauguin and actually the American sculptor engraver Frederick William McMonnies, who trained in Paris and continued to actually set up a studio there and actually lived and worked there for a number of years until he returned to the United States. Now we'll talk a little bit about what was going on artistically at the period. Sometimes this is referred to as the Beaux-Arts period of Beaux-Arts school, which in France basically covers the period from the end of the Franco-Prussian War, 1871, up until the start of World War I, 1914. And this was a period in France of peace, prosperity, advancements in technology, science, and of course the arts. And it refers largely to a school of architecture. It's sometimes used as a blanket statement to cover various aspects of art, but in particular, it covers architecture. And in terms of architecture, there was something of a neoclassic school at the time. And here we show some examples. There was, in America at least, examples of this style of art include the Boston Public Library, the Supreme Court, which is shown in the upper photo here, which was done by Cass Gilbert and Gilbert Jr. and John Rockert, and the New York Public Library, Manhattan, done by Carrier and Hastings. Okay, that now we'll talk a little bit about Art Nouveau. Then this is where the medalists come in. At the time, so this was influenced by what was going on generally in art, including other areas such as literature, music, painting, and it had to do with the 19th century, with what was the Romantic movement in art. And there was a greater expression of emotion, artistic freedom, in I guess in response to rejection to the earlier neoclassic style. And this style led to a period of expansion of art, particularly in France, and particularly in terms of medalists, with several very important figures. There was David d'Angiers, Hubert Ponscarme, Louis Oscar Rodi, Jules Clement Chaplin, and Alexandre Charpentier, among many others. But these are probably the most important figures. So, what was new about Art Nouveau? And there were several innovations here, some technical and some artistic. So, one probably the chief technical advance was the development of the reduction lathe. And this is what led to the involvement of sculptors rather than engravers. So originally you had sculptors, that was one field, and you had engravers. So you had people who made metals and had people who did sculpture. Well, the boundary was removed with the introduction of the reduction lathe, because now sculptors could take and design metals. So you could take and design something on a large scale, and with the reduction lathe now you could take and then reduce it to the size of the metal. Some were struck There were several over the years. The first in around 1830 was the Continental pantograph, which was developed in France. The U.S. Mint actually had a reduction lathe as early as the 1830s. And then around the time of the Civil War was the Hill machine in England, and the one probably the most prominent came out at the end of the 19th century was the Janvier reduction machine, which actually there's a medal dedicated to one in the lower right-hand corner by Charpentier, which was actually a number of them were sent over here at that time. In fact, in 1907, there was Herbert Herring was a engraver, a sculptor who worked with St. Gordon's, complained at the time, he was working at the U.S. Mint, complained to Teddy Roosevelt about that their reduction lathe was antiquated. So Roosevelt made sure he sent to Paris and had one of these machines sent here to the U.S. Mint at that time to replace their antiquated reduction machine. Another thing on an artistic level, there was a renewed interest in old techniques, particularly going back to the Renaissance. And the early Renaissance metals were cast rather than struck. So we have an example, for example, of David in the upper right-hand corner of a large cast portrait bust. And there was a renewed interest in that style. There was the development, the return to the plaquette, which was something which was used during the period, again, of the Renaissance, which was then renewed, particularly with Oscarodi and others during the period of Art Nouveau. And as an example, in the lower left-hand corner. Again, so now metals are not necessarily coin-like, they're not necessarily discs, but now they expand, they can become rectangular or other shapes. So now they become more of a canvas. They resemble paintings rather than just coins. So that's a change. Then the subject matter changes as well. We just don't have, it's not just commemorative. If you don't have a bust or maybe some allegorical figures, you actually can put in, as we see here, a landscape. So, the relief now, we're dealing with low relief very often, fine details, and the portraiture also changes because now there's greater realism in portraiture. Subjects we see in informal dress, we have is in the lower right-hand corner, we have people, workmen, people in industrial settings, farmers, people working in factories, laborers and such, so that, the subject matter expands greatly. It's not just meant for royalty for, people in upper echelons, but the average working class person is now depicted on medals. And there are medallic conventions which are broken, which are changed. So things that we see in medals earlier in the neoclassic and early periods, things like raised rims and beaded borders, raised devices for rising from plain fields, standardized letter punches, these are all basically done away with. So now, things, again, to make it look more painterly, you don't see the same edge devices, and you don't see, plain fields. Everything is done to make it a more homogeneous work of art. So let's talk a little bit about, he actually, I guess, predates the period that's considered Art Nouveau, but he's an important contributor to what comes later on, which is David d'Angiers. And we'll see this pattern with a lot of people, certainly in terms of France, and even with some of the Americans. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts under a couple of prominent, one sculptor and Jacques-Louis David, very famous painter. He won the Prix de Rome, so he spent 5 years in Italy. He also traveled to England and France. And he had numerous commissions for sculptures, monuments, busts, and such. His claim to fame is that he produced probably upwards of 500, what he described as medallions, which were portrait busts of famous men and women of his era, of the time. And these were done in a rather dramatic fashion because, again, he made these are large formats, very different than what had preceded. And let me show you. So, for example, here at the Musée d'Angers, the Toussaint Abbey, there are a number of his sculptures, which is shown to the left. And On the right is an example of one of the portrait medallions based on one of his busts. So to the left, actually in the foreground, we see a bust of Goethe, and we see the medallion to the right. So this is a large format. This is about 8 or 9 inches in diameter, and it's a well thought out piece, but it has a certain spontaneity about it. You can see the treatment of the hair. Because it's cast, it doesn't obviously have smooth feels. It's got, very, I guess we'll call them active feels, because obviously it's got texture to it. And but again, it has the sense of being very impromptu, but still it's a very well thought out piece, But again, the treatment of the hair, you can see the treatment of the facial features, the chin, the brow, the furrows in the brow, and all that. So it's a very dramatic piece, and yet it's very well done. As I said, this was not something he did. He just kind of wrote off, but he thought about this piece. But the impression is of something which is very spontaneous and lively, as opposed to the more academic material that existed up till that time. Other example. I'm sorry.
It's a sizable piece.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm saying 8 or 9 inches. It's that piece, right? And that's another thing. And again, going back to Renaissance, he revived this whole concept of the cast metal, which had basically fallen into disuse. A couple of more pieces. So again, we have this forward-facing bust of Napoleon to the left. Again, you look at the hair treatment and the bust, very dramatic. It's a really it's a very prominent, much different if you're familiar with the medals, many medals by Gayrard and a number of other people, Andrew, of Napoleon during his lifetime. This is clearly much different. Also large format, but just the image itself, very lively, very dramatic. But that's not to say that you can't utilize this format to come up with very fine, very delicate work. So we have Napoleon to the left, we have Josephine to the right. And of course, here you can see she's, very fine details. You look at the tiara, you look at the hair detail and such. So, it's capable of doing very fine work as well. So you've got the dramatic, and you've got also, which is also something you see in the Renaissance, this dichotomy between, of course, this very strong portraiture and also pieces of great delicacy. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about, because now David, influenced people. He wasn't really an instructor or teacher. People were aware of his work, so they kind of copied it, and we'll see examples of that. But somebody who was really directly involved with teaching, and then it now impacts on the American sculptor engravers, was Francois Jouffry, who was he first studied. He was born in Dijon and studied locally. He was admitted to the École Beaux-Arts in 1824, and again, as we said with other people, he won the Prix de Rome, and then he was a professor at the École des Beaux-Arts starting in 1865, and he had a number of very well-known, accomplished artists who studied under him, worked in his atelier, his studio, including I guess international, the people like Per Hasselberg from Sweden and Jose Nimos de Almeida from Portugal. But we see a couple names there, Olin Levy Warner and Augustus St. Gordon's, a couple of Americans who went over in the 1860s to study with him. So we'll just take a peek at a couple of his works here. So we have a piece here to the left, which is a figure grouping to decorate the Paris Opera House called Harmony. And if we look, just take a look at the central figure here, this winged figure, kind of representing Harmony, Nike, probably based on the earlier Greek goddess of victory and such. And just kind of remember that figure, because we'll see that figure again. Okay, so it's definitely had an influence, we know, on at least one American engraver. Okay, just to show another example of his work, here's a in a statue that he had made of Napoleon as a lieutenant, which is still on display now from 1857 in Burgundy. So this is one very important instructor in sculpture. We also have Alexandre Falguière, who was a sculptor and painter. Again, he interestingly also studied first in Dijon, went to school hard. He won the Prix de Rome in 1859 and also started teaching in 1865. And he had a number of illustrious students. We recognize a number of names, both French and American, but the Americans, we have Francis Elwell, John Flanagan, Herman McNeil, Bela Lyon Pratt, James Earl Fraser, among others. There were others. So it's like a who's who of American engravers at the turn of the 20th century. A couple of items that were done by Falguière. There's a grouping of there are statues at the Musée d'Orsay representing the 6 continents, some done by other sculptors. This was his contribution, the sculpture representing Asia. So you can see it's rather elaborate sculpture here. Closer to home, he and Anthony Mercier were responsible for producing the sculptures and this monument to Marquis de Lafayette, which is in Washington, D.C. And it's a rather elaborate. Lafayette has the primal place of honor at the top of this pedestal, but there are sculptures all around. There's a figure representing America at the base here holding a sword, and then other important French commanders during the Revolutionary War. So on either side, we have D'Estaing, we have the Comte de Grasse, Comte de Rochambeau, and so the Charles de Portail, all depicted on this rather elaborate monument here. Okay, also a very important instructor here is Henri Chaput, who was a French sculptor more in the neoclassical style. He studied at the Petit École and then eventually studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in 1849. Studied with a couple of prominent French sculptors at the time. He also won the Prix de Rome. And he's known especially for his statue of Joan of Arc as a young maid, shown here in the upper right. And also here's a plaquette that he did representing Joan at a somewhat later date. He taught at the private academy, the École Académie Julian. And again, among his students, we have John Flanagan, Herman McNeil, and Bela Lyon Pratt. So very often, the Americans would go and they would study in multiple venues. They'd study at the private academies if it was possible that they could apply and get into the École des Beaux-Arts. They did in several instances. So that's why you'll see the names under several different people here, because they study with multiple people. And now I just want to mention Hubert Ponscomé, because in the area of Art Nouveau, he is pivotal. He's critical in terms of establishing the basis for this art. He actually taught. He was also studied at the École des Beaux-Arts under Audenet and Dumont and Merle, who was sculptors. So he studied both metal making and sculpture, and again won the Prix de Rome. He was the medalist for Louis Napoleon and designed, we'll see, the award medal for the 1867 exposition. And he was responsible for a number of innovations, which we'll discuss. And he was appointed professor at the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, his students were primarily French, not so much American, but he definitely exerted an influence, because if we look, it's again a who's who of French, the Art Nouveau engravers: Oscar Rodi, Charpentier, Uvid Yancès, Abel Lafleur, Adolphe Rivet, and Paul Niclaus, all very important engravers. And this is actually his self-portrait. So again, he's kind of channeling the spirit of David. Again, this large format cast plaquette. And again, you see, the free use of the styling of the hair and what have you. So again, it shows the lineage, the influence here. Okay, so Interesting. This is his Universal Exposition medal from 1867. Okay, a very traditional neoclassic medal. We see that he's got, the portrait of Louis Napoleon, with the wreath, flat fields, standardized block lettering. The reverse, he's got this image probably representing Nike, or the sometimes referred to as the genius of the exposition. She's holding plans of the exposition, kind of floating above the globe here. Again, block lettering. We've got the raised border, flat field, very traditional, very neoclassic. Now, 1867. We go forward a year, and we have this. Okay. Now, this is a medal that was done to honor the 50th anniversary of Joseph Naudet, who was a Latin sculptor and poet. His membership in the Academy of Belles Lettres, the inscription Belles Lettres, much different. What a difference a year makes. I mean, this is like, again, if we just to go back, okay, here's Louis Napoleon, again, very standard neoclassic. A year later, I mean, amazing the transformation. Okay, I mean, this medal was considered so revolutionary that the director of the Paris Mint, Jean-Baptiste Dumas, called it deliverance. He actually had copies of this medal sent to every other medalist that did work for the Paris Mint to show them this is what's possible in terms of producing medals. This is what art can be, as opposed to what art was up to that point. And we look at this medal now, there are a number of features here. First of all, there's the portrait, of course. I mean, we have this obviously gentleman of, somewhat advanced age, and he looks it. It's a very realistic portrait. You can see in terms of the depiction, the hair kind of loosely done. You see the facial features. You see the furrows around the mouth, and the chin, and the kind of the furrows in the forehead and stuff. So very different portraiture. We look at the field, so we don't have those kind of flat mirror-like fields. It's a unified work of art. So the fields are somewhat matte. They kind of flow from the portrait. It's defined, but it's not as sharply defined. And the lettering is part of the composition. Okay, we don't have standard block lettering. The lettering is part of, these are kind of engraved into it. It's part of the entire image. And what are we missing? No raised borders, no dots. Again, no block lettering. We don't have the polyfield. So again, it's a much different composition than the earlier piece of Louis Napoleon. So this was Roger Marx was a prominent French critic who was involved very much in Art Nouveau and actually in medals in particular. Said about this piece in his writing, he said, "A revolution, that medal, this particular medal." Oh, just to as an aside, most of the medals that you see in this presentation, I have down in cases at the MCA exhibit. Okay, it was a little too much to drag up here. I wanted to bring them so people could see them, but if you'd like, if you're intrigued by these medals, you just have to go downstairs on the floor. They're all downstairs, so you can see these medals up front and personal. Okay, just a couple of prominent people in the field of Art Nouveau in France. There was Jules Clement Chapelain, very important, a sculptor medalist. And again, he carried forth these innovations in medal making in the Art Nouveau. Again, we see the same pattern. He entered the École des Beaux-Arts 1857. He studied under both Jouffre and Audinet, sculpture, medal making. He also won the Prix de Rome. He was in Rome for several years. He actually was very prominent in French medal making. He was the official medalist for the French government in 1877. He designed gold coinage. He designed medals for the official portraits of the presidents for a number of years. He was admitted to the very prestigious Academy of Beaux-Arts, and he also taught at the Academy. So just to see a couple of his pieces. Again, now this is a plaque which is about 6-inch diameter. This is actually I have downstairs. The portrait of Madame Jean-Mathilde Claude from 1887. And again, we can see features of Art Nouveau. Again, it's a unified work. We don't have the various features that we'd seen in the early neoclassic. Again, the delicate handling of these various features, the lettering, but the portrait itself, which is sculptural. I mean, if you look closely at the hair, there's as much suggestion as there is actual detail. So there are like flat portions. So that's taken, as I say, it's kind of a melding of kind of painterly image sculpture as well as metal making. The portrait itself is very fine, very delicate, but we look at the handling of the drapery of the dress and all that, and there's fine details, but there's also, as I said, it's almost cubist. You've got different planes and shapes and things like that. So it's an interesting contrast between, that's to say, the delicacy of the portrait, the handling of the hair, and the handling of the drapery. But it's very, very charming depiction. Just one example of one of his struck pieces is well known. This is his medal for the award medal for the Universal Exposition of 1900. Again, we have the planchet is basically used fully. There's no border items and such. So here we have to the left, it's the obverse. It shows this image of Marianne representing France, kind of head kind of growing from the ground. Then we have this oak tree behind, and we have actually the wreath, which is it's an extension, it's a branch from the oak tree. And in the distance, we have it's the exposition. It's Paris, but again, it's modeled in low relief, so we get this sense of perspective of distance. So again, it's painterly as much as it's sculpture. And the reverse, we have again this image of Nike, but she's not. It's not like free floating in this empty space, but it's actually carrying this, sometimes described as a worker or an award winner. But again, we have this workman on our back holding a torch. And we have images also of the fair in the background. But again, we have a foreground, we have a background, there's a sense of distance here, so, and again, it's a unified composition, we have, wreath below and the plaque and everything like that. But again, we're looking at a fully developed work of art here, not just, as I say, an image on a plaque with like I said, beads and borders and such. So, just an example of one of his many metallic works. Also, very important artist, sculptor, engraver of the period, Oscar Rodi, and again actually won the second prize for the Prix de Rome in 1872 and the first prize in 1875. And he studied with a number of people, both painters and sculptors, including Panspermé, and he won many awards during his career. He won the Grand Prix at the exposition in 1889. He was a president at the Academy in 1888. He became president of the Academy in 1897. And his main claim to fame was reviving the Renaissance plaque. So going from this format, round format, to things which represented more of like a sculpture, painting, the canvas. This is an earlier work of his. This is his son, Maurice, shown at age 4 in 1886. And here we see use of the plaque format. And, again, it's, just this lovely portrait of his, son, age 4. And we can see the reverse. he has this, image of just this, branches with blossoms on it. And again, it fills the image. We don't have any borders, so the entire image is taken up by this kind of florals scene here. And then, as I said, this he did in many different versions subsequently. Here's a medal, which again we had seen an earlier medal done of somebody of advanced age, obviously the medal by Ponscomé. So this is I love this medal. This is Michel Eugene Chevreul, who was an important organic chemist. He discovered a lot of compounds. He was actually involved in the production of dyes. And for artists, he's important because the famous color wheel of complementary colors and things was his innovation. He was the one that developed that color wheel around 1839, thereabouts. But here he is at age 100. He lived to be 102. So here is a medal commemorating his birth centennial. And well, when you're 100, you kind of look like that. This is somebody. So again, the realism is there. You can see the hair is kind of a little, you're at 100. Yeah, all right. It's kind of it is what it is. Comb it, nah. It's kind of free flowing. He was kind of like the Einstein of his era. You can see how the hair is handled, and you see again the face. It's a very warm impression, but again, you see again the wrinkles around the mouth and the forehead, and the chin, and the coat, which doesn't exactly fit perfectly. You can see it looks like it's a little big on him, as one might be. It may be at age 100. You can see how the coat is kind of draped on him, particularly on the reverse. It has this image. He's being honored by Maryam to the left, and he's kind of sitting in this chair. But again, it's a very warm but very realistic portrait. This gentleman at age 100 and showing him, but it has a certain humanity to it. You can see from the portrait. It's a marvelous portrait, and again, it fills the planchet here. You don't get the sense that it's that it's like limited like a coin, but it's expansive. Probably his masterpiece is this work, which is the death of Sadi Carnot. Sadi Carnot was president of France, who during a period they were having problems with some attacks by anarchists, and he was in Lyon, 1894, and he was stabbed to death by one of the anarchists at that point. And this medal was produced a few years later to honor Sadi Carnot, the death of Sadi Carnot. And it's extraordinary. And again, you see the plaque format, but again, it's extraordinarily evocative, very dramatic medal. On the upverse, you see him lying out on his funeral bar here with the image, presumably, of Maryam, France's draped figure, who's standing over him, and it represents the grief of the country. You see him draped here with the wreaths, and in particular, you see on the reverse his coffin being carried by these kind of eerie, almost otherworldly figures, these draped women carrying him off towards the Pantheon in distance where he was lying in state. But it's otherworldly. I mean, if you look at that portrait, you've got this, in this case, this open space, you've got these figures, you've got this sense of perspective, see how the figures are and how the coffin, how it's handled with the Pantheon off in the distance. But again, it's the low relief and again, this is typical of Roti in that it's more painterly. This is certainly not high relief, slow relief, but it works to his advantage here because again, you get this feeling of distance, of like it's almost in the mist here. It gives you a very almost eerie kind of feeling here of solitude, of isolation and such. But it's a masterful example of Art Nouveau, how this technique can be used to evoke different feelings. I mean, it's one of his greatest works. Okay, well, we've been spending time, the topic is, Americans in Paris. We've only barely spoken about Americans in Paris, but I thought, to lead up to it, we wanted to take and discuss these. So now we're going to talk about the Americans. Okay, so we have the earliest Americans were Olin Levy Warner and Augustus St. Gaudens. They arrived in Paris during the late 1860s. They studied with Jouffroy at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. We also have Henri Chapeau. He mentioned he's teaching sculpture metal making at the Académie Julienne. And again, we have figures like Flanagan, Herman McNeil, and Lion Pratt, who studied with him. We have Alexandre Falguière, who's teaching at the École des Beaux-Arts for those Americans who could get into the Écoles des Beaux-Arts. There were several, again, Flanagan, Herman McNeil, Pratt, and Fraser. Now, interestingly, Victor D. Brenner travels to Paris in 1898, but he travels there specifically to study with Oscar Rodi. And it's interesting because Brenner, unlike the other people that we mentioned, was primarily a metalist. The others were really sculptors that did a little bit of metal making, but he was interested particularly in studying with Rodi. And then actually a lot of Americans, we think of them, well, they went there and studied, but they actually stayed in Paris, some for many years. I mean, Augustus St. Gaudens set up an atelier there, a studio there. His assistant, Frederick MacMonnies, taught there and lived there for many years. And Janet Scudder was a pupil of MacMonnies, actually spent most of her life in France. So, not only did they study there, but a lot of them actually remain there. So just a word about Oscar Levy Warner. Here's a name that, as numismatists, we don't really know that well. Basically, he worked there early. He was born in Connecticut and worked as an artisan and telegraph operator. He studied with Jouffroy and also was assistant to another sculptor, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. He moved to New York in 1872. He founded the Society of American Artists. He was associate of the National Academy of Design, and he did a number of sculptural works. Here, there's works. He did sculptures for the Brooklyn Historical Society. This seated bust portrait of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist in Boston Commons, General Charles Devens, which is also in Boston, and these tympanums above the doors of the Library of Congress in Washington. But he's also has something to do with the Columbian $50 and badges, which he usually doesn't get credit for. I'll just mention that. Well, here's one of his portrait plaques of Thomas Fenton. There isn't too much information about Thomas Fenton. I think it was thought to be a friend of his. And again, it resembles a lot of the early plaques we had seen by people like David and Ponce Garmet. Again, you see, the large format, the hair details and such. So obviously, again, he learned from, what was going on at that time in France. Other things he did are actually, he did a series of these, now we see the American aspects. He traveled to Oregon and did a series of these portrait plaques of Native American tribes in that region. This is one of Moses, who's chief of the Okanogan tribe, which is in Oregon, in 1893. And again, we can see here, the prominence, the treatment of the hair, the prominence of the busts and all that, a lot of information that includes here. So again, he's kind of utilizing the French techniques to create American, kind of art. Just to mention, because he's not mentioned in this regard, but he's actually pretty much the designer of the Columbian $50. Okay, even though they said Charles Barber designed it, Barber just took his designs and basically he just copied them to make it. Okay, we have basically the Columbian $50, and this was his image of Columbus, and he came up with the idea of the caravel above the obverse and the two hemispheres. Okay, this is Barber's design for the Columbian $50, which obviously looks nothing like the Columbian $50. So this was Barber's design, which was rejected, and they basically used Warner's design to create the Columbian $50. But Barber gets credit for it, but it wasn't Barber's design. It was Warner's design. Okay, now we'll talk about, obviously, heavy hitter in terms of the American sculptor engravers, Augustus St. Gaudens. who actually was born in Dublin but grew up in New York. He was originally a cameo cutter. In fact, that's him to the left there as a young man. He studied at the Cooper Union, National Academy of Design. 1867, travels to Paris, studies with Jouffre. He also travels to Rome in 1870 to study art and architecture there, which is important because that's probably where he was exposed to to Italian Renaissance medals. And he became familiar with people like Pisanello and Donatello and important early Italian sculptor medalists. And there he is as an older man. Okay, just to mention his first, because he was in France when he did this. This was his first important commission, which was for the statue. So he gets the commission in the 1870s to produce a statue for New York of Admiral Farragut, David Farragut. And it's a $9,000 commission. So this really helped to, it helped him financially, but also helped his to cement his reputation. So he leases a studio on the left bank in Paris. Also, Stanford White, very well-known architect, comes over. He's a friend of his. He was designing the pedestal for this statue. Okay, very fastidious, very slow working. It takes him probably a couple of years. He's working on a clay, the mock-up of this bust, and we can see, and he agonizes. Actually, Farragut had passed away at this point, so he gets actually the uniform from his widow to have details of the uniform, of the buttons and whatever. He manages to get some photographs out. So he's working for all this stuff in Paris, and he agonizes over the uniform, over the facial details. He mentioned specifically the left leg. He was having problems trying to figure out how to position the left leg properly, but he gets all these things right. He casts this in 1880 in February. It's actually cast in Paris. It's shipped by rail to Le Havre and then comes over by boat to New York. So the pedestal, then he also does the sculpture on that. There are two figures done in actually Hudson River bluestone, representing loyalty and courage with fish and waves. You can see he's got this composition here with the bench and with these sculptures and such here. And the unveiling happened on May 25th, 1881, to great acclaim. This was a major success of his. And you look at that portrait of Farragut. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful portrait. You see the determination and the strength in that portrait. And, if you're in New York, you can go to Madison Park. It's still there, and then you can see this sculpture there. But this was his first triumphant work of art in sculpture. And, there are many other very famous sculptures that he did. It's Abraham Lincoln, which is in Lincoln Park in Chicago. It's the 1884-1887. Below that is a wonderful, if you go to Boston Commons, there's this memorial to Robert Shaw and the Black Regiment in the Civil War, which is a very elaborate piece, great piece. A very famous image of Diana, which stood on the pinnacle of the second Madison Square Garden building. And of course, below that is the William Tecumseh Sherman equestrian statue, which is in front of the Plaza Hotel in New York. And lo and behold, here is the striding figure representing victory, winged victory, which has a very striking similarity to the Jouffre figure that's standing in front of the Paris Opera. I wonder where he got that idea from. Okay, his mentor, his teacher. Okay, so we have this piece. So now this is this is Renaissance art, Art Nouveau meets American, Art Nouveau. So here's his probably first work of medallic art. This is the inaugural Centennial Medal honoring George Washington, 1889. This was done. This is a piece which is about 4.5 inches in diameter, cast, not struck, cast, of course, in this size, done by Gore. And here again, this is, it's Pisanello, channeling Pisanello through Augustus St. Gaudens. We have this portrait of Washington on the obverse, in civilian bust. Also, the image of of civil authority, the fascists behind Washington. Again, the printing, you see the lettering, very sculptural. This is not done by a punch. This is done by hand. And we have this reverse where we got the arms of the city of New York, this eagle on top with a broad wingspan and the shield. And of course, the statement here, the lettering, but again, very sculptural. Okay. And again, it fills plan. But the fact that this is cast and we have this image of Washington as such, so this is really a great work of art, so his first masterpiece. This was also done in a small struck format that was given as a medal to members of the committee and such. But of course, the great work is the large format. There were also 10 of these done in silver, obviously great rarity, but these are really readily available, but it's a great piece. So another piece done just a couple of years later, the Columbian Exposition Medal, which was, I guess we'll say 50% St. Gordon's, although the work, now St. Gordon's had a number of people working for him, so we'll say St. Gordon's, but also, we don't want to belittle people like Adolph Weinman and Philip Martini and others. So, for example, the Washington piece, Philip Martini was actually involved with that. Adolph Weinman and others were involved in the others. Very often, Augustus St. Gordon's would design the pieces, and he would have his assistants kind of do the dirty work, the actual modeling of the thing. So very often these were conjoined pieces, but he usually gets the credit. But so in any case, we have this image on now these were actually, the dies were done at the U.S. Mint. So these sometimes they're referred to as being a U.S. Mint product, but they were actually struck by Scoville that I think at the time was in Connecticut. So that's why they're kind of sometimes referred to as U.S. Mint, Scoville, but they were actually kind of like done in a sense by both. So the obverse is St. Gordon's. And here we have, again, this very dramatic image of Columbus, kind of stepping forward onto the new world. Images and back again, we have this full, it's full use of the planchet, very nice metal. Now, all the way to the right, we have his version of the reverse, which was this nude male figure supposed to represent America. He's holding these kind of victory wreaths and this torch. We also see a little eagle here, which comes back again. He reuses things, so kind of remember that eagle. And again, you can see the lettering and how again this is like a fully realized image here. Well, apparently this didn't do with the people, the convention authorities. They, of course, the male nudity was looked down upon. So they commissioned then Charles Barber came up with this alternate reverse, not as dramatic, kind of mundane. So with these two apparently topless women are okay, bottomless men are not okay. So you have these two images here with the globe, and of course, the Columbus ship below. It's okay. It's obviously not as dramatic as what could have been, but and then rarely there are a few examples of the reverse which come up at auction, and when they're very highly prized, but they do exist. But this is the standard one. They made about 25,000 of these medals. And of course, needless to say, this created great enmity between St. Gordon's and Barber, and down the road when it came time to produce coinage, it's still surfaced. So, after this, needless to say, Augustus St. Gordon's thought much less of Barber. Barber didn't care for St. Gordon's. It certainly didn't help matters. Another piece of St. Gordon's is this piece, which actually was primarily the work of Adolph Weinman. We have the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural medal. There was actually a smaller format medal that was done officially by Barber, which has, the kind of standard portrait of Roosevelt wearing kind of a, suit and everything like that. But, Roosevelt, of course, didn't care for it, so that he then had this one commissioned privately. So you have this much more dramatic image of Roosevelt. And lo and behold, no, you don't discard a good idea. Here's the eagle, back again, the reverse. And of course, people familiar with American coins, of course, know that eagle because it ended up also on the $10 gold piece on, St. Gordon's, $10 gold piece. And here we have this image of Roosevelt, kind of dramatic, this bust. And yeah, it says actually, Roosevelt's known for, quote, square deal. Well, there it is in Latin, Equum sucre. So, and of course, the eagle. And again, very dramatic. This was cast. This is Tiffany made these 125. Whenever these come up at auction, obviously there's great demand for them. The smaller uh, uh, barber pieces more readily available. These are, of course, always in demand. It's a great work of art. Okay, so go on now. Augustus Saint Gordon is also important because just like the French who then trained Americans, he in turn trained other Americans. So you see the lineage here. So he had a large number of people who he had as assistants in his studios, both in Paris and here. So we see names including Fraser, Henry Herring, Charles Keck, Mary Lawrence, Francis Grimes, McMonnies, Martini, Payne, Weinman. And we see there some of them represented there. Actually, we have Fraser, his Weinman left. That's McMonnies, Francis Grimes. Harry Herring is actually probably best known. If you go to Cleveland, there are these figures in Cleveland on the bridges. These are the Guardians. Sometimes they're referred to as the Guardians. And that's his probably his biggest, well-known work of art. In any case, we'll talk about some of these people. Here's Frederick McMonnies, who's really known primarily as a sculptor. So we don't have that many medallic works. We have one which we'll look at. He was born in Brooklyn. He worked, you see, as an apprentice for St. Gordon's as early as 1880, and he was studio assistant. He studied at the National Academy in New York at the Art Students League, which is still in existence there. He travels to Paris in 1884 and studies at the Academy, the private Academy, Colarossi, and then at the Beaux-Arts. And then he opens his own studio. So here he is, an American in Paris, 1888. And he has assistants, including actually prominent female sculptors, Janet Scudder and Mary Foote. And he becomes an instructor at the Academy Vidi. And then he returns to the U.S. in 1915. And then he opens up a studio in New York, but he spends many, many years in Paris. Examples of his work, well, we have this statue of Nathan Hale in front of City Hall in New York, which is an imagined image. There are no images of Nathan Hale, so he imagined this is Nathan Hale. He was a school teacher, so he's dressed as a school teacher. He has his hands bound, his feet bound, as one would expect for a prisoner of the British. And but as I say, this statue still exists there. Now to the left, many other, but there's this interesting image of this bacchante, this female reveler holding a bunch of grapes. Obviously, she's had maybe one or two too many, and she's holding this infant fawn. This piece was actually commissioned by, it was in Boston, but apparently this was too racy for Boston. So it was actually donated to it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art now, but it was considered kind of a little too daring at the time for Boston. So it's in New York if you want to see it. His medal, this is a wonderful medal, is this medal that he did it's the fourth issue of the Society of Medalists, which started in 1830. This is 1831. So he did this medal commemorating Charles Lindbergh's flight to Paris. There was a medal which was awarded a U.S. congressional medal that was done by Laura Garden Fraser, who's a superb medalist. But in this instance, I think his is better. He got it right. Hers is kind of staid, has a kind of profile image of, but here, and actually I was able to find the photo that he based this on. So you can see there's the image of Lindbergh wearing his aviator cap, and there he is on the medal, virtually identical. And it's got, if you see the medal here, I guess you can kind of make out, it's a very lively medal. Here is, again, it's that Art Nouveau. It's got lively surfaces, it just doesn't have flat fields. So it becomes part of the composition. He kind of almost he juts out, he pops out of the medal. It's like a very lively image. And the reverse, again, has this allegorical thing. I mean, you see allegories going back to Louis XIV, but here again, it's very lively, very active, kind of more up to date. So he was known as the Lone Eagle. So you have this eagle flying. You have the crowned image of death here, but he's defying death. You've got the winds blowing in this direction. You've got storms, attempting to slow him down this direction, but unperturbed, he continues on through all this, this danger. So, this is metal. It's readily available. It was done in this gilt bronze. They minted almost 2,000 of them, but it's always in demand because it's a wonderful metal. Both because it's Lindbergh, but just the imagery is just great. Again, very active, very lively. Symbolism is wonderful. So yeah, again, he got it right. And again, he absorbed all that, the lessons of the Art Nouveau. Okay, Herman McNeil. So again, he was born in Boston. He studied at the Massachusetts Normal School. He got a teaching position actually at Cornell for several years. He was teaching drawing to engineering students so they could take and do architectural drawings. But he would manage to take, during his free time, he traveled to Paris in 1888, and he studied privately with Chaput at the Académie Julienne. He then, after working at Cornell, he then leaves Cornell. He returns to Paris in 1890. He's admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts, not easy to do. And then he studies with Falguière, although I think artistically he was closer to Chaput. Falguière was a little more advanced. It was a little more progressive. Chaput was a little more traditional. I think he felt, in his writings, he says he felt more comfortable with Chaput. He returns to the U.S. in 1891. He then works with Frederick McMonnies to create, and Laredo Taft, who were in Chicago for the Columbian Exposition, and he's responsible for helping to produce a lot of statues that were exhibited at the exposition. He then actually moves to Chicago. He's teaching at the Art Institute for some years, and he travels. He becomes fascinated at the exposition with Native Americans. So he then travels to the Southwest, and he goes to the Hopi Reservation, Navajo and stuff, and he studies them, and he actually creates some portrait plaques of Native Americans, and it figures with some of his later work. He gets a scholarship, Reinhardt Scholarship, and then he goes to Rome for 3 years in 1896. So he's exposed to French art, Italian art, and such. Then returns to the U.S. 1902, and he sets up a studio in New York. And I know him because he's a local boy. I come from Queens, New York. His studio is in College Point, so not far from LaGuardia Airport, if you've ever flown into New York, LaGuardia Airport. In fact, there's a statue of his, which I never realized, which is on Northern Boulevard, which is right nearby, just standing there in the median to this road there. But in any case, he returns to the U.S. He then becomes a teacher at the Pratt Institute, the Art Students League, and National Academy of Design. He has a number of prominent students that he taught there. Just to show you a little bit of, because again, we know him, of course, he designed the Standing Liberty Quarter. That's how he's known to us. But most of his work was done as a sculptor. And he studied, Native American art. So we have this sculpture here to the left called the Sun Vow, which which he produced while he was living in Rome. This sculpture is a Native American sculpture holding a bell. One of his last pieces actually is this piece to the left, which was for a monument to honor the Pony Express, which still exists in St. Joseph, Missouri, which was 1940, one of his last pieces. So again, with many, many pieces in between. But he did do some wonderful medallic work, which you may or may not be familiar with. This is a wonderful piece. And again, if you want to see this piece, they are downstairs in the MCA exhibit. The Pan American Exposition Award Medal, 1901. So obviously he uses his expertise in terms of knowledge of Native Americans on the reverse, but the obverse, he said specifically to Mel, he wanted to create, again, he's utilizing what he learned in Paris, again, the Art Nouveau techniques, but he wanted to come up with something which was expressively American. Okay, he wants to do something it doesn't smack of European kind of academic, kind of academy, but rather is American. And I think he succeeds remarkably well with this piece. He has this obverse image, which is sometimes described as America or Colombia, and then of course you can't get more American than a bison, in the background here. So we've got this nude figure striding forward. And it's sometimes been described as intellect triumphing over for brute force. So you have, the woman in front, the bison in the back, and of course that bison later on shows up with the work of Fraser, with of course the Indian head buffalo nickel, and the reverse. Again, we have two Native Americans, one North American. This would be a Plains Indian. You can see with the headdress and all that typical garb, and then seated with a South American Indian. There's this one probably representing Inca. You can see the woolen cap and such, and they have shields. One with of course, the shield with North America on it, with the shield of South America, sharing a peace pipe here. But again, it's a wonderful image, and expressively American. There's no doubt that this was done by an American sculptor, and that was his purpose. He did many others, so I just to pick an example here. This is his medal that he did for the tercentenary of New York City. This is the Dutch purchase of Manhattan for his so-called $24. So here we have the image on the obverse showing the transaction occurring with the ship in the background and such. And here on the reverse, we have these images that are supposed to represent liberty. You see the wing figure and civic achievement. She's kind of holding this glowing globe here. And we see images of Manhattan kind of in the background. This was a conjoint effort of the ANS and the New York Historical Society. Their initials are they're on the reverse to the lower left. And it's a wonderful piece. It's, again, kind of in the spirit of Roti. It's in low relief. Very, again, you see the various details here. You see, though, he does have some kind of border devices here, but they're not your standard devices. He's got kind of this double edge, kind of this more detailed border. But again, we've got this very, very dramatic reverse here. The reverse is kind of historical, but the reverse, again, you have these striding figures, this male figure, female figure conjoined. And again, it kind of fills the planche. It's very, very lovely, very dramatic medal. Now, again, he returns. He did the third medal in the Society of Medalists series, and we have this image of this so-called Hopi prayer for rain. So there's the Hopi, the famous Hopi snake dance. They actually take venomous snakes and they're dancing with them in their mouths and things like that. Needless to say, not a rather risky thing to do, but he depicts it here, and he has this running image where after the actual ceremony, they then return the snakes out to the desert, and hopefully they'll get their prayers answered and they'll get rain. It just so happens that I happened to come across this image here of an early sculpture called the Moki Runner. So we know where he got his image, his reverse image from.
So that's not his. Not his sculpture.
No?
Is that his?
That's his sculpture, yeah. Oh, okay. I thought you knew something I didn't know. Because I was looking through and they said this was sculpture. This he had done, of course, many years early, probably after he had been to the Southwest. But obviously he took and he reutilized that image when he created this reverse. And again, this is actually a slightly ovoid piece. It's a little irregular. And again, you see it fills void. This one probably now, this is later, so there are aspects to it which I guess would be maybe a little more almost Art Deco. You see, he's got these images on the obverse representing, these are Hopi symbols for rain. You see the clouds and the arrows and such. So it's a little more, has a little more symbolism there. But again, a great image. Oops, I think I missed somebody there. Oh, there we go. Okay, John Flanagan. Now, we know John Flanagan from the Quarter. Probably his least successful work of art, Washington. But so a little bit about him. To see, born in Newark, New Jersey, studied at Cooper Union, as many did. He was assistant to St. Gwen's for 3 years, travels to Paris, 1890. He studies, actually, again, he did the 3 schools. He studied at the Academy Colarossi, studied with Chaput, with Julian with Chaput. He studied at the École Beaux-Arts with Falguière, which we saw other engravers did. He now becomes an assistant for MacMonnies, also with the work on the Found Group at the Columbian Exposition. He returns to America in 1902. Okay, sculptural, well, here's probably one of his best works of art, the Rotunda clock in the Library of Congress, this rather elaborate piece. You can see the sculpture above, a medallion below, which he utilizes later on. But again, his portraiture is really excellent, except like the Washington, for some reason, is a very staid portrait. He did this portrait actually of Leo Tolstoy. He was just doing a series of prominent artists and such and writers. And he did this what's a rather large plaque of Tolstoy. I have an image, photo of Tolstoy there to the left, and you can see this portrait, very realistic, very dramatic. You can see in terms of, I mean, handling again the beard and the facial details and stuff, and the face. I mean, the eyes are really very penetrating. You get this feeling that he's looking right at you. It's a really very dramatic portrait. Certainly much different than we associate with like the Washington portrait. So this is really a wonderful example of his ability to really come up with really very active, very dramatic portraiture. Okay, in terms of other medallic art, well, he did the Pan Pac Exposition Award medal, which was struck at the U.S. Mint. Here's an example in gilt bronze. Even though it's called the gold medal, they were all done in bronze. Some have been silvered and gold. So here we've got this allegory on the reverse, on the obverse, I should say, the Pacific and the Atlantic meet, of course, with the building of the Panama Canal. So we have this allegorical image on the obverse. And the reverse shows the Tower of Lights, which was one of the prominent features at the exposition. And again, it's a rather, it's Art Nouveau. Again, you've got these allegorical images, but again, it's fully realized. It fills the planchet here. We've got the background, we've got clouds, and we've got the image of the canal in the distance here, and the image of the fair itself here. And so, again, it's very, very much characteristic, done, for an American purpose here, but he learned his lessons in France. Again, just another example of one really wonderful portraiture. Here is the birth centennial of Walt Whitman. And again, I was able to find this photo, which clearly he based the image on. So, I mean, it's almost identical. And again, again, you see the hair detail, the drapery of the clothing. And again, it's a very warm, doing forward-facing portraits are not easy. And I think this is a very successful portrait. And again, you get this, this very warm image of obviously an aged Walt Whitman here, and the treatment though of the hat and the coat and everything. Again, it's very sculptural, and it's a great portrait. Why he didn't come up with something better for Washington is hard to understand, considering he's actually a great, this was his forte, actually. Now, here's his contribution to the Society of Medalists. He comes up with, again, in the Art Nouveau vein, this wonderful obverse portrait of Aphrodite, this reverse image of this runner grabbing the torch, it's obviously representing kind of the future, taking the torch from the past and all that. But at this point, this was 1932, and he had passed his prime artistically. And actually, we know that these images were actually taken from earlier portraits. The reverse, I showed you the clock from 1896. So this was the medallion that was below the clock that was shown from 1896. This runner was taken from there. The portrait of Aphrodite was actually taken from a medallion that he had done for the Knickerbocker Hotel in 1904 for Auguste Belmont in New York. So he recycled them, but the original portraits actually dated from an early period when he was, I guess we'll say, a little more artistically, advanced, or he was experimenting more in the style. A few more people: Bill Lyon Pratt. Again, he grew up in Connecticut. He studied at Yale, and he studied in New York as well. He was assistant to St. Gordon's. He traveled to Paris. He studied again he did the Triumvirate. He studied at Colarossi. He studied with Chaput. He studied with Falguiere, as others did. He returns to America in 1892, and he actually was involved. He was the head of the sculpture department at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston from 1898 up until unfortunately his death in 1917. He was only 49 when he passed away. Just a couple of examples of his sculptural art. If you go to the Boston Public Library, you'll see these two seated figures, these two women. These represent the allegory of science to the left, holding a globe, and the allegory of art to the right, see holding a palette and paintbrushes. So again, just to emphasize the fact that these people were very accomplished sculptors, and the medallic art, nice though it is really secondary. Their primary role is really as sculptors. I mean, I was looking at his output. It's just amazing. Some years he came out with 6, 7, 8 pieces that you'd think that would take him years to sculpt. And he was like pumping these things out, I mean, regularly. Every few months he'd come out with another sculpture like this. So just interesting. Now there's, sale coming up. I won't mention too many details. I'm interested in these pieces, but in any case, there's actually the Pratt family must have recently released some pieces for sale. And it's interesting because, we said these people studied in Paris. So do we have any documentation? Well, it turns out that he was awarded a couple of medals when he was studying in Paris. So here's actually his award medal. This was done, the medal itself is done by a couple of French engravers, Jean Lagrange and Henri Dubois. So this is an award medal that was issued for, obviously excellence in art at the Academy Colarossi, one of the private academies. You can see B. Pratt on the reverse. So he got an award for that at the private academy. And here is probably the more, I guess, illustrious, the more prominent medal that the Three Grace Award medal, which was given at the École des Beaux-Arts. And you can see here, he won 3rd place. I'm not sure who got 1st and 2nd. That must have been pretty good. But sculpture, you see, for figure modeling after nature for Mr. Pratt, 1890, 1891, when he was studying at the École. So it's just neat to have these examples of that documentation that he was there. That he won these award medals. So he studied at Yale. Okay, so 1901, they wanted a medal to take and honor the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the university. So they come to him, and he comes up with this medal. And this is a wonderful medal. Again, you have, this fully figured, this obverse. You have this image of it says truth, a light and truth on it. So light is represented by Apollo, his chariot, and he's being led by this female figure representing truth, which is, holding a wreath and palm with the torches and the inscription on the reverse. So this is, again, a very classic, low relief, but, highly detailed medal on the obverse. We have this portrait medal of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which we did for his birth centennial. Again, here we see, he does have the border around it, but it's done almost like it looks like it's framed. So it's acanthus sleeves. It's done a little bit differently. So it's a little more sculptural rather than just having like a bead or something with the inscription on the reverse. And again, nice portraiture. Great piece. Here is the piece he did. This is one of the A&S medals, thought to be an A&S medal, done for the opening of the New Theater of New York on November 6, 1909. This exists in a couple of versions. There's a 77 millimeter struck piece. This is the one that's the exhibit I have downstairs. Is a 105 millimeter cast metal. And it's a great point. You have this image on the obverse of this seated nude figure holding a mirror, and this image on the reverse. It was supposed to be in word metal. So you have this standard figure, this woman holding this garland and a plaque could be inscribed with these two cherubs kind of drawing back the curtains, as it were, on this metal on the reverse. So a really rather large, very, very beautiful, very dramatic metal, and done in very limited numbers. So this is 50. I think there were 50 done in silver in a smaller format and 100 done in bronze. But if you see this metal, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful metal, as you can see it downstairs. Kate mentioned also James Earl Fraser. He grew up in the kind of the upper, I guess we'll say north of here. He was born in Minnesota and grew up in Dakota Territory. So he studied at the Art Institute in Chicago, went to Paris in 1894, and again studied primarily with Valguier. At that point, Tabor had actually passed away, and took classes at the Academy Julienne and Colarossi. So again, he studied at the same places. And he was assistant to St. Gordon's for several years, both in Paris. And then when St. Gordon's returned to set up his studio in New Hampshire, he followed him there and he was working with him there as well. And then he established his own studio in New York City. And here we have a photo of him. Interestingly, on purpose, I put this photo because here you see he's doing a bust of TR, Teddy Roosevelt. So here we have a couple examples of his sculptural work. The piece to the left, if you want to see, you just have to go a couple of miles north of here to the Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. That's his very, very famous statue, End of the Trail, which he had done in plaster. And it was, I think, in some park in California for a number of years, and it was deteriorating. And finally, they reacquired it, and it was restored, and now it exists there. This is known. There are many copies of this in bronze. It's a very famous statue. You have this, kind of defeated Indian, defeated horse. The horse looks kind of droopy. The Indian is kind of droopy, but it's a very famous statue of his, which again, growing up where he did, he was familiar with Native American culture. I could have done 100 images. There's many, many examples of sculpture by him. This is a large sculpture. If you go to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, you'll see this big, big bust of Benjamin Franklin. See the portrait of Benjamin Franklin there. It's a great sculpture. But again, one of many. Great portrait. Actually, I compare this favorably to the St. Gordon's portrait. I like this one actually better. It shows Teddy Roosevelt here on this posthumous bust. He had actually done a bust of Roosevelt, which is in display in the Capitol. They have busts of they actually done as vice president. He was commissioned to do it, and he did it in 1906 when Roosevelt was president. And he did this bust with a statement below that he actually Roosevelt had said earlier, I think 1895, talking about I think he calls it progressive fighting for the right is the noblest sport man can afford. Great statement, great image. And again, this plaque is available, but it's just a wonderful portrait. Also a great medal. This was done for this was a medal, the Harriman Memorial Medal, which is awarded to railroads for excellence in safety, improving, safety. Obviously, working on the railroads is a rather dangerous profession. So measures that they would take to improve the safety for their workers. So he has Harriman on the upper. This actually medal was the award was commissioned by his wife. Harriman died in 1909. This was first produced in 1914. But what's great is you see this reverse image. Again, it's kind of follows from where we've spoken about people like Charpentier. So you have this workman here. So he's got his lanterns and his flags. He's carrying them, inspecting the track, and he dominates the reverse on this medal. Again, no borders or anything like that. But you have this image of some working class imagery here of this, as I say, this track inspector, and appropriately on this medal to help improve railway safety. So great image, great medal by Fraser. All right, I can't leave out, of course, Victor Brenner. Okay, he was born in Lithuania, learned jewelry engraving, emigrates to New York in 1890, studies at the National Academy of Design. Now he went to Paris in 1898 specifically to study with Charpentier and Rodi. And he returns to New York and then sets up a studio working as a medalist. And his work, he becomes an active member of the American Numismatic Society and does a number of their medals. But unlike the others, we don't have examples of his medal working, but we do have his examples of his medal. So we have here Lincoln. Of course, I don't have to say much about that. Probably his most famous work. This is a great plaque of his. He did this for the J. McNeill Whistler, again, plaque format. And if there's a plaque that can kind of project the personality of an individual, it's this one. Whistler was kind of known for his temper, being a persona of persnickety. And if you look at this image of Whistler staring at the artist, you can kind of guess that he was a little bit annoyed that he had to pose for him. But you get that image of his personality. The reverse has this peacock, which he did because he was known. He had done work for who was it? Leland. Frederick Leland had painted. That was supposed to do a little bit of artwork for his dining room. Painted the whole dining room, including a Renaissance leather wall that he overpainted. That was worth, I think, $1,000 at the time. So Leland was, of course, annoyed at Whistler. Whistler was annoyed at Leland, so he put this kind of anthropomorphic peacock. He painted onto the wall representing Leland, because he was annoyed with the show gold coins at the base of it. So the peacock ends up on the reverse, and this Monsieur les Ennemis, the gentleman, the enemies, comes from actually his Whistler's biography, autobiography, which he titled "The Gentle Art of Making Enemies." So that's where the statement comes on the reverse. But again, it's a great portrait, and again with that kind of rather annoyed image of Whistler. And just to show the converse, this is his medal that he did for the Circle of Friends, which you see here, the mother and child, which is a very common image done by many medalists here, really very well done. And you have this chair blowing the trumpet on the reverse. Here he's channeling his mentor, because here's his version of it, 1911. Here is Oscar Otti's medal they did for the baptism of his son in 1893. So you can see clear parallels here. So obviously he learned his lessons from Roti in terms of, working low relief and the imagery itself. Okay, to mention Janet Scudder, she's the only woman noticed here. There were several, but she was probably the most prominent. She was born in Indiana, studied in Cincinnati, moved to Chicago, and she did work at the Columbian Exposition, also sculptures, went to Paris, studied at several of the studios. Then she was working with Frederick McMonnies, and then she came to New York briefly and then returned to Paris and spent most of her life in Paris. She did spend some time in New York. She was known for making fountains. She went to Rome and was enchanted by the fountains there, made what was called the Frog Fountain, which was very popular, and then made a number of fountains and garden sculptures, and then returned to Paris and was there most of her life, returning periodically to New York, and then just returned here in 1939, just prior to her death. And here's an example of one of her plaques. Many of these are exhibited in France. You'll see these at the Musée d'Orsay. And again, this is like very typical of Renaissance art. So it shows this very delicate depiction of Louise Hartshorne Moore with her pet dog on her lap. Like a lot of paintings of that period, the dog actually kind of, in a sense, is a reflection of the personality of the person that's depicted there. So you can see this kind of very kind of frou-frou, kind of made-up dog on the lap of this rather frou-frou image. You see a lot of detail, the hair detail and the fine detail of the dress and all. So very nicely done. She did a number of these plaques. Here's one of a child, which is charming. You have this child with one leg dangling. He's got his pet elephant toy there. And the border here, actually, if you look closely, they're all toys. They're all little like pull toys and things like that, different animals and things. So it's a charming little medal here of this, this child here wearing his sailor's cap, holding his pet elephant here with all his toys, in the periphery here. Okay, the one medal, which we actually have a small example of, is downstairs here. She was commissioned. She was, obviously came from Indiana, so she was commissioned in 1916 to produce this medal for the statehood centennial, which has this image on the obverse of the representing probably the United States, the larger figure welcoming the child, which was Indiana, to as a state. And this is the Indiana State seal on the reverse. You have this woodsman and this rising sun over this field with this bison, which is like taking off from the woods, presumably heading off to the plains. Done in 64 millimeters, done by Mako. This was a smaller kind of award. It was probably worn as a medallion, which is the one I have downstairs. Again, I realize it's getting late. Just to mention a few other people here briefly. We have Adolf Alexander Weinman, obviously very important sculptor, engraver. Did not study in France, but he did study. He did work for Augustus St. Gordon's and Olin Levy Warner, among others, until he eventually opened up his own studio. Just a couple of pieces of his. He did this medal for the Louisiana Purchase. So again, you see again the Art Nouveau influences here, fully formatted. Here again, we see actually similar to Janet Scudder piece, although this came earlier, the larger image of Columbia welcoming this smaller, younger portrait representing the Louisiana Territory with these various kind of emblems in the periphery. We have, the reverse has the eagle with dolphins below, and we see there's a little cartouche here. There's a French fleur de lis below, and then there's in this cartouche, there's the initials of Napoleon Bonaparte and the United States here, so representing again the transfer from France to the United States. These come in a variety of shapes. This particular one's the Gold Award. There's a shield-shaped one, which is the Grand Award. There's a square one, which is the Silver Award, and there's a round one, which was a commercial, so-called commercial award. So this is a wonderful series, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition medals. And this is a much later one. So that with 1904, here it is, 1949 comes out with this medal. It was the 39th in the Society of Medalists series. So it's called Genesis, this Web of Destiny. So here we have an image representing presumably God, Nimbate God, with his creation, Adam here. And the reverse has this one of the Norns who was the one of the weavers of destiny here. She's holding a distaff here with a thread with arrows behind here. But again, different imagery here. Here, I think we're actually kind of getting a little bit into. It's a little more sparse, But so it's maybe just veering into Art Deco a little bit. But again, wonderful imagery done by Adolf Weinman. And again, a bunch of other people. I won't belabor a little bit, but Helen Farnsworth Mears, Herbert Adams, Henry Heering, Chester Beach, Gutman Borglum, which is interesting because you think of him as like Mount Rushmore. You think of him, these massive, displays, but he actually did a little medallic work. But they all studied in Paris. And again, they studied at the various academies. And, Helen Mears was also worked with in the studio of St. Gordon's. Interestingly, Herbert Adams set up a studio in Cornish, New Hampshire. He was a neighbor of St. Gordon's after he returned to the United States. Henry Heering was also an assistant for a number of years at St. Gordon's studio up until St. Gordon's death. Chester Beach set up a studio in New York, and Gutzon Borglum. Actually, interestingly with him, he went to Paris. He studied with Mercier, and who was a sculptor who also worked with Falguière. He was very impressed, though, with the work of Rodin. So when he was there, he didn't study Rodin, but he observed the work, and he kind of, in his work, he channeled a lot of what we see with Rodin, these kind of very massive, very, dramatic works of art. And then he set up a studio in New York. So just a few pieces. This is a piece by Herbert Adams. This is an A&S medal of Joseph Choate. We see again, it's very sculptural. You see kind of the not finely finished facial details. It's more of like the sculptural. You see various planes. The hair is kind of simply done. Again, more sculptural than the painterly, and the reverse again fully realized. This is his medal for the Academy, for the Society of Medalists. Now we're getting a little Art Deco-ish. I won't talk a lot about Art Deco, but you start to get some simplicity response to this, and you see it's kind of geometric. The waves on the reverse, the plane field. So we were moving a little away from Art Nouveau. Chester Beach, a couple of his pieces. This is the, again, very fully realized kind of dish surfaces, the Actors Fund Medal here, which was awarded to actors for contributions to, not clear if this was an A&S medal, but, and then also for the Treaty of Versailles, very low relief here, symbolism representing peace and justice on the obverse, and the Palace of Versailles on the reverse. It's hard to see because it actually is very, very low relief. Again, something characteristic of that. And Gutzon Borglum represented by the A&S medal for the members medal here. And just a couple of additional things. Oscar Louis Roti, although he was in France, he did full commissions here. He was so popular. So here's his medal for the 50th anniversary of Cooper Union, which was commissioned by Peter Cooper's daughter. And again, here we see, Peter Cooper on the obverse and this image of the Cooper Union, the building, and the kind of in the distance here with this figure here, representing, I guess, kind of I guess, education and such. He's sitting reading a book. And just to mention also Jules Edward Rouenet, who was a Frenchman who came to New York, met the Wheel brothers, who then formed Mako, then went back to France, actually studied with Roti and Vernon, then returned here. And he did a number of medals. This is his medal for the ANS for the Lincoln Centennial, really very nice medal. It was kind of a contemplative seated Lincoln being crowned here by Fame. And with that, that's the end of my talk. So I've taken you through, I think, quite a bit of French and American medalists. But and here's a bibliography. There are a number of books that relate to this topic. I have a few of them here. And again, most of these medals are downstairs. So if you'd like to see them and discuss them further, they're all there for the viewing and discussion.